In 1840, a 17-year-old bricklayer named George Spilsbury sat alone under a massive oak tree in the English countryside. He later recorded that in that quiet field, a voice spoke directly to him, declaring that he was destined to become a preacher. Within a year, George attended a meeting where an American missionary made a bold assertion. A modern prophet named Joseph Smith had seen God face to face, and ancient divine authority had been restored to the earth. Convinced by the man's scriptural arguments, George was baptized that very night. He immediately set his trade aside and began traveling as a missionary across Herefordshire and Wales, preaching the gospel and sleeping wherever he could find a bed. George's conversion immediately turned a local tradesman into a global migrant. He left behind his trade, his family, and his country to follow a theological map that ended in a city he had never seen. The physical toll of his new life became obvious almost immediately. While traveling in squalid conditions in Wales, George contracted a severe rash. An ill-advised remedy of dissolved mercury nearly killed him, forcing him to hike 17 miles and preach 3 times while violently ill. In 1843, George married Fanny Smith, and the young couple prepared to leave their homeland for America. They were completely broke. On the day of their departure, George had to borrow money from a fellow traveler just to buy their train tickets to the port of Liverpool. The voyage across the Atlantic almost ended in disaster. As their ship, the Yorkshire, entered the Gulf of Mexico, a midnight tornado sheared off the main mast, crashing the heavy timber and rigging directly onto the deck where George and Fanny were sleeping. They survived, but arrived in New Orleans stranded in the heat with 0 funds. Fanny wept at their humiliating situation. Undeterred, George pawned his own clothes as security to borrow money for steamboat tickets up the Mississippi River. Enduring disease, poverty, and a near shipwreck required a deep, singular obsession. For the Spilsburys, every physical hardship was a calculated risk against one goal: reaching the city of Nauvoo to look an actively speaking prophet in the eye. The couple arrived in the contested city of Nauvoo, Illinois, in May of 1843. George immediately took a grueling job carrying hod for local bricklayers to survive, while the community around him poured its resources into raising the massive stone walls of the Nauvoo temple. It was here that George finally met Joseph Smith. He observed a man born in the backwoods, unlearned in worldly wisdom, who nevertheless quoted scripture in Hebrew and German. George noted that Smith possessed a boldness that knew no fear, paired with a remarkably profound intelligence. But the utopian peace of Nauvoo fractured rapidly. By early 1844, men who had stood closest to the prophet, including William Law and the Higbee brothers, formed a secret covenant specifically to plot Smith's overthrow and assassination. The conspiracies culminated in late June. While held at Carthage jail under a pledge of state protection, Joseph and his brother Hiram were murdered in cold blood by an armed mob whose faces blackened with gunpowder. The violent deaths of their leaders did not destroy the pioneer movement. Instead, the assassination forged a hardened, unshakable defensive resolve in believers like George, who immediately began heavily guarding their burned-out settlements against further attacks. Through the winter of 1845, the community's focus shifted out of pure necessity. As vigilante mobs pushed them out of Illinois, George and the men of Nauvoo spent their days frantically chopping timber to build wagons for a mass evacuation. Having no team of his own, George fled south. He worked his bricklaying trade in St. Louis and St. Joseph, Missouri, saving every spare cent to purchase a wagon and oxen for the long journey west. The Spilsburys finally launched across the Great Plains in the summer of 1850. For months they navigated hostile terrain, survived massive cattle stampedes near Fort Laramie, and carefully managed their rapidly dwindling provisions. The hazards of the trail were constant. At one crossing, Fanny's wagon plunged 4 feet down a steep bank, overturning into the water. Their 8-day-old son, Alma Platt, was pulled from the wreckage completely unresponsive, only reviving after an intense priesthood administration. By the time they reached the valley, the Spilsburys had lost their cattle, their provisions, and nearly their youngest child. The trek west had demanded every ounce of their conviction and the physical resilience required to colonize the desert. The Spilsburys arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in October 1850 to find a wilderness that required immediate, large-scale engineering. George went to work at once, hauling wood from the mountains, digging cellars, and building the first permanent houses of a new territory. George remained constantly on the move, obeying relocation assignments from church leaders. He moved his family from Salt Lake City to Draper and eventually deep into the harsh, isolated terrain of Utah's southern Dixie Mission. Wherever he went, his masonry skills proved invaluable. He spent years digging cellars, hauling timber, and raising heavy stone and brick walls, laying the physical infrastructure for entirely new communities. He also embedded himself completely into the heavily persecuted doctrines of his faith. Over the coming years, he entered into plural marriage, integrating Anne Coop and Harriet Wanfor into his growing family structure. For pioneers like George, there was no separation between physical labor and spiritual devotion. Digging an irrigation ditch or building a home in the desert was executed as a direct theological mandate. By the early 1900s, George was well into his 80s, but his drive hadn't slowed. He routinely traveled over 1,000 miles a year on rough dirt roads, riding stages and trains to Mexico and California to gather his widely scattered descendants. He left them with a strict written manifesto known as his Instructions to the Family. He demanded that his posterity hold annual reunions, unconditionally perform proxy temple work for their ancestors, and strictly pay a tenth of their income in tithing. To prove the value of his covenants, George pointed directly to his own body. He credited his stamina and flawless health at 84 entirely to his strict adherence to the word of wisdom, an abstinent health code prohibiting alcohol, tobacco, coffee, and tea. George Spilsbury's life spanned the crossing of oceans, plains, and deserts. He transitioned from a teenage bricklayer in England to a patriarch in Utah, leaving behind a massive, multi-generational framework of faith and duty that his descendants continue to navigate to this day.